I mean, you have to really guess. You look at him, you could smoke a cigarette in the rain with his forehead and sagittal crest. It's so big from drug use.
In the gritty, lawless dawn of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, one man stood apart, not for refined skill or elegant technique, but for embodying pure, unbridled chaos: David "Tank" Abbott. The forgotten fury of Tank Abbott is a tale of a fighter who stormed into the cage with raw aggression, leaving an indelible mark on a fledgling sport, only to face a heart-wrenching decline that stripped him of his strength and erased his name from the annals of MMA history. From a street-brawling legend in Huntington Beach to a UFC icon whose body now betrays him, Tank's journey is a saga of wild victories, devastating losses, and a relentless fight to be remembered in a world that moved on without him. In the early 1990s, the UFC was a raw, untamed spectacle, a far cry from the polished global empire it would become. Rules were minimal, gloves were optional, and fighters were often untested in structured combat. Into this chaotic arena stepped Tank Abbott, a man who shattered every expectation of what a martial artist should be. He wasn't a sleek, disciplined competitor draped in a black GI, nor did he boast a cabinet of trophies. Instead, he carried a beer belly, a collection of scars from unsanctioned street fights, and an aura that radiated danger. Hailing from Huntington Beach, California, Tank was a product of rough coastal bars and back alley scuffles, more at ease throwing punches in a dive bar than bowing on a dojo mat. His background in amateur wrestling gave him a foundation, but his true skill was honed outside the ring, in the gritty, lawless world of street fighting. By the time he entered the UFC, he was already a local legend, whispered about in Huntington Beach as a man who could end any fight with a single, devastating blow. Tank's UFC debut came at UFC 6 in 1995, a night that cemented his reputation as a force of nature. Facing John Matua, he didn't just win, he obliterated his opponent with a knockout so ferocious it felt less like a sporting event and more like a street riot captured on camera. As Matua lay convulsing on the canvas, Tank stood over him, taunting with a smirk that was both chilling and magnetic. The moment was raw, ugly, and unforgettable, splitting the audience. Some cheered for his audacity, drawn to his unapologetic aggression. Others recoiled at his lack of sportsmanship, fearing the volatility he brought. Tank didn't care. He wasn't there to win hearts or titles. He was there to unleash chaos. Unlike the calculated precision of Ken Shamrock or the cerebral grappling of Royce Gracie, Tank was a whirlwind of fists and fury, a barroom brawler in a sport struggling to define itself. His unpredictability made him a star in an era where spectacle was as vital as skill. Fight after fight, Tank returned to the octagon, undeterred by losses. His bouts were wild, chaotic affairs that drew eyes, whether he won or lost. He nearly toppled the formidable Don Fry in a brutal slugfest that left fans breathless, and he demolished Steve Nelmark with such force that Nelmark's legs buckled like a marionette with cut strings. Each fight was a performance, Tank flexing for the crowd, his grin masking the toll his body was taking. Behind the scenes, though, the cracks were forming. The grueling weight cuts to make weight class, the heavy drinking that fueled his reckless persona, and the complete disregard for recovery were eroding him. Tank lived as he fought, fast, fearless, and always teetering on the edge of collapse. The UFC, still in its infancy, leaned into his chaos, knowing he could be counted on to deliver a show that packed seats and sold pay-per-views. For a time, his raw energy was enough to keep him relevant, a draw in a sport hungry for larger-than-life characters. But as mixed martial arts began to evolve, Tank remained stubbornly unchanged. The UFC was transforming into a legitimate sport, with fighters training in striking, submissions, and cardio to become well-rounded athletes. Tank, however, clung to his roots, raw power and wild swinging fists. He didn't adapt to the new wave of technical fighters who studied tape, honed strategies, and prioritized endurance. The sport outgrew him, and younger, leaner, more disciplined competitors pushed him further from title contention. Tank didn't seem to mind. He fought for pride, not championships, and his defiance made him a fan favorite, even as his losses mounted. But pride led to reckless decisions. He accepted fights he had no business taking, stepping into the cage underprepared, out of shape, and visibly deteriorating. One of the most infamous moments of his later career came against Kimbo Slice, another street fighting legend. Billed as a clash of titans, the fight ended in disaster for Tank, who was pummeled in under a minute. The crowd jeered, but Tank walked away with a grin, perhaps hiding the sting of defeat and the shame of his fading prowess. The losses piled up, but the physical toll was far worse. In an era with minimal medical oversight and loose regulations, Tank absorbed punishing blows, fighting through busted knees, cracked ribs, and mounting pain. To cope, he leaned heavily on painkillers and alcohol, a dangerous combination that deepened his spiral. His personal life mirrored the chaos of his career. Stories surfaced of bar fights, legal troubles, and burned bridges with promoters who once banked on his name. Tank's larger-than-life persona wasn't an act. It was who he was, and it came at a steep cost. He was offered opportunities to pivot, commentary roles, reality TV appearances. But his rough edges and refusal to play the corporate game made them fleeting. The UFC was becoming a polished billion-dollar brand with fighters who were media-savvy and Instagram-ready. Tank, with his unfiltered attitude and barroom swagger, was a relic, a man out of time in a sport racing toward legitimacy. As stars like Conor McGregor and Jon Jones dominated headlines, Tank faded into obscurity, his name barely mentioned in the sport's growing narrative. Then came the fall, not in the cage, but in the brutal reality of his failing health. In 2018, Tank was diagnosed with end-stage heart failure, a devastating blow that left doctors grim. They gave him months to live, his heart too weak to carry on, his body too battered from years of abuse to offer easy solutions. Fans who had watched him shrug off punches that would fell lesser men were stunned by images of Tank in a hospital bed, his once robust frame skeletal and swollen, hooked to machines that kept him alive. His eyes, once fierce with defiance, were barely open. A heart transplant was his only chance, but his history of heavy drinking and chaotic living made him a risky candidate. Transplant boards scrutinized not just his vitals but his lifestyle, and Tank faced a harsh reality. To even get on the list, he had to change everything. He sobered up, shed weight, and fought to prove he wanted to live. Not to fight again, but simply to survive. This was a battle against time itself, waged in hospital rooms and ICU beds. After an agonizing wait, Tank received a heart transplant. It saved his life, but the man who emerged from the hospital was unrecognizable. He had lost over 100 pounds, his once powerful muscles withered, his face hollowed out by illness and recovery. Worst of all, the man who once knocked out opponents with a single punch could no longer walk without assistance. The human wrecking ball now relied on nurses to shuffle to the bathroom. In rehab, he faced the humiliation of relearning basic movements, his pride warring with the reality of his fragility. Every step was a struggle, every day a reminder that his body, once a symbol of unstoppable force, had become a prison. The fearless brawler, who once laughed in the face of pain, now shed quiet tears through grueling physical therapy. The image of Tank Abbott as an invincible force was gone, replaced by a man dependent on others for the simplest tasks. Yet he pushed forward, not with the swagger of his youth, but with a quiet, stubborn resolve to reclaim what he could. Recovery was neither swift nor triumphant. Nurses knew his name, not as a UFC legend, but as the patient who needed extra help to stand. Each session in rehab was a battle to regain a fraction of his former strength, standing without a walker, walking a few steps, living without the constant fear that his new heart might fail. In rare interviews, Tank tried to summon his old bravado, grinning as he declared, "I'm too tough to die." But the strain in his voice and the exhaustion in his eyes betrayed him. Decades of head trauma had left their mark, slowing his speech and clouding his memory. Mid-sentence, he'd falter, mixing up fight dates or forgetting names. A stark reminder that the damage wasn't just physical. He was fighting not just for mobility, but to hold on to his identity, to remember who Tank Abbott was, when the fists stopped flying and the crowds went silent. The deepest wound wasn't the pain or the scars, it was the silence. The MMA world he helped forge had moved on without him. New fighters, polished and strategic, didn't speak his name. Promoters didn't call. Commentators glossed over his contributions in retellings of UFC history. It wasn't just a physical decline, it was an erasure, a slow fading from the sport he bled for. In a bid to stay relevant, Tank turned to the podcast world, joining independent MMA shows where his stories became a lifeline to his past. His episodes were raw, unfiltered, like the man himself. He recounted knockouts, near-death moments, and nights of drinking before fights, his voice carrying a strange pride, as if he'd survived something primal. Fans of the early UFC flocked to hear him, drawn to the authenticity of a man who lived without pretense. But not every story landed. Sometimes his tales rambled, losing coherence. Sometimes his humor carried a bitter edge, lashing out at the UFC's softened image. At modern fighters he saw as pampered, at promoters like Dana White, who seemed to forget the pioneers. He wasn't entirely wrong, but the sport had changed and Tank hadn't. His health was impossible to ignore, even on audio. His breathing grew labored, his sentences slower, his energy fading mid-episode. The reality of his condition hung heavy, a reminder that he was fighting for more than relevance. He was fighting for survival. At one point, he floated the idea of a final fight, perhaps against an old rival like Tito Ortiz, or even a YouTuber. He laughed, but the suggestion fell flat. No one believed it was possible, not with a transplanted heart, not with a body that struggled to stand. Still, the podcast gave him a voice, a platform to remind the world that Tank Abbott mattered, that he wasn't just a footnote in MMA history. Each episode felt like a plea. Don't forget me. Don't let this be the end. But the podcast invitation slowed, and the MMA news cycle churned on, consumed with new stars, new controversies, new champions. Tank, who once headlined events and struck fear into opponents, became a whisper among hardcore fans, a trivia answer fading with time. He lived in near isolation, with no Instagram, no coaching gigs, no appearances at UFC events. The organization never inducted him into its Hall of Fame, never featured him in retrospectives. The man who once stormed into bars like a hurricane now needed help getting out of his car. The fighter who mocked weakness now battled his own fragility daily. In rare interviews, his words carried a quiet pain, not from the surgeries or the punches, but from being forgotten. "I was there," he said, his voice heavy. "I helped build this, but no one wants to hear from me now." His health continued to falter, his movements slower, his speech more jumbled. The laughter when it came felt weary, like a man recalling better days he knew would never return. The UFC's transformation into a billion-dollar juggernaut left no room for Tank Abbott. He was too raw, too unpolished, too much a reminder of the sport's brutal, unregulated roots. No sponsorships awaited him, no Hollywood memoirs, just an eerie silence that settles when you've been erased by something you helped create. The few fans who remembered him spoke of him like a legend from a bygone era. Remember when Tank knocked out Matua? Remember when he nearly finished Fry? The word remember became his legacy, because memories were all that remained. Those memories were fading too, drowned out by TikTok highlights and sanitized documentaries that skirted the grittier names of MMA's past. Tank didn't want pity, but he deserved acknowledgement. Without fighters like him, the UFC might not have found its spark, the raw, visceral energy that drew crowds who didn't care about technique, but craved violence, heart, and spectacle. He gave everything to the cage, his body, his health, his spirit. In return, he got bruises, silence, and a legacy buried under the sport's polished facade. Yet Tank kept showing up to life. He woke each day, took his medications, dragged himself to physical therapy, and pushed his broken body beyond what doctors advised. He fell, got back up, fell again, and rose once more. Not because he believed he'd fully recover, but because standing, walking, breathing were his new victories. Doctors warned that he might never walk properly again, that his transplanted heart remained at risk, that every complication-free day was a miracle. But Tank, never one to heed caution, pushed harder than he should, driven by the same stubborn fire that once fueled his fights. The emotional toll was heavier than the physical scars. He had to confront the myth he'd built, the fearless brawler who strode into the octagon to cheers and fear. Now he was a man with a scar down his chest, leaning on a walker, staring into a mirror at a stranger. The dissonance between who he was and who he'd become was crushing. Yet he didn't break. He cracked jokes in interviews, thanked his organ donor with quiet gratitude, and showed up to small fan conventions when his body allowed, signing autographs with trembling hands and a smile that still carried a flicker of his old defiance. If the industry wouldn't honor him, a handful of loyal fans would, remembering not just the chaos but the heart behind it. Tank Abbott's story is more than a personal tragedy. It's a mirror held up to the flaws of combat sports. We lionize champions, we elevate showmen, but we discard the pioneers who laid the foundation. Men like Tank, who fought in an era without gloves, weight classes, or robust medical protocols, built the UFC's early fire. He wasn't perfect, brash, reckless, often unkind, but he was real. He stepped into cages knowing he'd likely leave broken, and he did it anyway. For the thrill, for the paycheck, for the roar of the crowd. Now, in a quiet rented home in Orange County, he flips through channels, watching a sport he helped shape and seeing no trace of himself. No highlights, no tributes, no nods. Just silence, as if the punches never landed, as if the chaos never erupted. But it did. Those who saw him know. We cheered when he roared, winced when he fell, laughed when he taunted, gasped when he bled. He made us feel something raw, something real. That matters. Tank may never get the grand ceremony, the Hall of Fame plaque, or the standing ovation he deserves. But his story demands to be told, not to glorify the destruction, but to honor the cost. Legends aren't forged in pristine gyms or viral clips. They're carved in blood, sweat, and silence. Tank Abbott was a legend, not because he won titles, but because he embodied the untamed spirit of a sport finding its way. Today he fights a different battle, one without a cheering crowd. His heart is borrowed, his body frail, his strength a shadow of what it was. Yet he endures, waking each day to face an opponent that doesn't tap out, time itself. His words are slower, his laughter softer, but the fire in his eyes still burns, however faintly. Those who remember know what he gave. Every scar, every drop of blood, every beat of a heart now held together by surgery and sheer will. His legacy lives in the broken rules, the wild swings, the raw energy that modern MMA has tried to tame. He didn't fit the mold, so history buried him. But his story lives here now, in these words. So the next time someone speaks of the UFC's early days, ask them about Tank Abbott. Ask why his name is rarely spoken. And when they pause, remind them. The sport they love was built on the backs of men like him. Men who gave everything and got nothing but bruises in return. Tank's fight isn't over. He still wakes, still breathes, still walks, no matter the pain. That's not just a story of decline. It's a testament to a warrior who refuses to fade, even when the world has turned away.